In the previous lesson, what we did was look at the relationship that was had between Charles I and Scotland more generally, and talked about, for example, the First Bishop's War. In this lesson, what we're going to do is basically that same thing, but focusing on the relationship that Charles had with Ireland instead. So, ultimately, what happened with Scotland was a very slow and progressive increase in tensions, often and notably due to a number of religious divisions that were had. Some of these religious divisions were had in relation to the imposition of religious practices on the part of Charles in Scotland. Others were generally just religious differences due to the fact that the Reformation took place in different ways in both England and Scotland. But all of this ultimately culminates in the breakout of the First Bishop's War between the Covenanters, who supported the clergy's national covenant, and Charles and his forces in 1639. Now, we're going to examine the political differences and the developments that take place between Charles and Ireland between 1629 and 1640 in this lesson. Now, essentially, we are talking about an individual known as Thomas Wentworth, who was the Lord of Strafford and was who had become in 1632 the Lord Deputy of Ireland. Now, Wentworth is going to be very, very important when we start to focus on the Civil War itself and the outbreak of the Civil War with his execution ultimately. Spoiler alert. But for now, we're going to focus on how his policies relate to that of Ireland. Ultimately, what his goal was to instantiate and develop closer relationships between a number of differing and conflicting interest groups within Ireland itself. And there are three main groups that we're going to focus on in this lesson. We're going to focus on the group that are described as the Old English, so Old English settlers who were, for religious purposes, generally more leaning towards Catholicism. There are also the New English, and who, as the name suggests, were leaning towards more Protestantism and who settled in Ireland much later. And we also have to think about the relationship between the English and the Irish in terms of their political settlement, so the Irish Parliament. Let's begin with the Irish Parliament. Let's begin with the first of these, because this was arguably the most positive of the relationship. Because essentially what this was where Wentworth came and developed deep relationships between himself and the Irish Parliament in such a way as to allow the Irish Parliament to grant subsidies to the English. So that was one of the things that was achieved as a result of the relationship between Wentworth and the Irish Parliament. In addition to this, what he managed to do was also allow, or at least manage to convince the Irish Parliament to double the rate of customs duties with the issuance of a new Book of Rates. Now, what this ultimately means in terms of those who are not any way or in any sense economically proficient was it essentially leads to an increase and a culmination of an increase in revenue towards the English crown. We know already that during the reign of Charles I, finances are one of his biggest problems. We have finances being one big problem and the religious differences between him and his people being the other. And at the end of the day, when we talk about finances, the fact that we have actually quite a positive policy towards finances with the Irish Parliament, it does set this particular policy apart from all the rest, which were overwhelmingly negative in terms of his ability to manage his finances and the results that leads. What about some of the more tense relationships that existed then? So think first about the relationship with the Old English. The first question is, who were the Old English? Well, they were descendants of a number of settlers who were English, who had settled in Ireland in the medieval period, so a few hundred years before this period that we're talking about now, with Charles and the general Stuart periods that existed. They were, for the most part, Catholic because of essentially the descendants of these settlers were Catholic when they moved to Ireland because of the fact that Catholicism had spread around for all of Europe, and Catholicism was the dominant orthodoxy at the time, and of course with the fact that the Reformation hadn't taken place during the medieval period when the English settlers actually landed in Ireland. So for the most part, they were Catholic, and over many generations, they had been successful in establishing a certain degree of class status within Irish society. They actually formed part of a growing elite structure within Irish society that became known as the Old English. And what would happen is that they would have quite a tense relationship with people like Thomas Wentworth for a number of different reasons. One of these is the fact that Wentworth issued and implemented a policy known as plantation. Now, what the policy of plantation was the settling of English and Scottish individuals on the lands which ultimately belonged to the Old English. So obviously we can see why that would culminate quite a tense relationship between Wentworth and the Old English, because he was trying to take their land and trying to settle other people on their land through this policy of plantation. The result of the interference of land with their land and the policy of plantation was the fact that Charles and the Old English entered into an agreement known as the Graces. And what the Graces agreement was an agreement between the two groups, between Charles and the Old English, where it was agreed that Charles would not interfere with certain lands of the Old English, i.e. they would not implement this policy of plantation. And in return for this, they would receive a fixed sum of income. Again, this is also a good financial decision on the part of Charles, because it meant that more revenue was entering into the hands of the crown. Finally, then, we have to think about the relationship between Charles and the New English, or more specifically, between Wentworth and the New English. The division between the Old English and the New English essentially hinged on the time period in which they arrived. And this is not necessarily a division in terms of a tension between the two groups, but how we just clearly define the Old English versus the New English. There is obviously a time period in terms of when they arrived. The New English, as the name suggests, arrived at a later period than the Old English and therefore become the newer settlers. But it also meant that there was also a difference in terms of religious divergences. There was a divergence in terms of the religious practices. The Old English, as we've already mentioned, were mainly Catholic settlers, whereas the New English were actually more Protestant. They leaned towards more Protestantism. And as Protestants, the New English would actually clash more with Charles over the imposition of Armenian practices. We know already that there was this imposition of Armenianism on the part of Charles and Archbishop Laud, and one of the results of this was the fact that they would clash quite significantly with the New English. The New English also tended to gain quite a significant amount of wealth, but not through productive means, but rather through corrupt practices. And this meant that not only would they clash with the ideological religious beliefs that were had by Charles, but they would also clash with Wentworth specifically over the fact that they were all quite corrupt. An example of this was the fact that two prominent New English settlers, i.e. Richard Boyle, the Earl of Cork, and Francis Annesley, the Lord Mount Norris, both were prosecuted by Wentworth for various corrupt dealings. So essentially the relationship between Charles and Ireland was arguably significantly more positive than the relationship between Charles and Scotland. We will get to in the future the relationship between Charles and Ireland as it pertains to the Civil War itself. Again, more positive, albeit not particularly helpful for Charles. But the next lessons are going to focus on the devolving of the political situation in England all the way to the ultimate culmination in the outbreak of the Civil War itself. We're going to talk about the long Parliament and the short Parliament, and we're going to talk about the events that lead up to the Civil War itself and the outbreak of conflict. And then we will spend some time focusing on the First Civil War, focusing on the attempts to gain some kind of a settlement during the first, or at least after the First Civil War. And then we'll talk about the outbreak of the Second Civil War and the ultimate culmination in all of these events, which is, of course, the destruction of the monarchy, the execution of Charles, and then the period that leads into the restoration of the monarchy afterwards.